Okay, Chair.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bridge. Morning, everybody, and welcome. I think we're all like coiled springs at this time of the morning, all raring to go. The purpose of this meeting is that we want feedback from the education scrutiny panel on our views on the budget as it relates to education matters. So welcome. Are there any apologies, Bridge?
Chair, just one from the co-opted member, Beth Elender.
Okay, great, fine, thank you. Obviously, are there any disclosures of personal and prejudicial interests? If there are,
prejudicial, because I mean we're all governors, I guess, and affected potentially.
Yeah. Okay, but anything, get hold of Bridge, and obviously, as we know, there's a prohibition of whip votes and declaration of party whips. Public questions? Don't think there have been any, so we're racing through here. Then the annual budget proposals, and I don't know who's going to kick off. We welcome Robert Smith, our cabinet member, and Helen, Director of Education, and Kelly. That really welcome. So who wants to? Robert, you first, and is it Helen first?
If I introduce the item, and then I'll ask Helen first, and then Kelly to talk us through the report. The figures are presented in front of you, along with the response from the school budget forum. I think they're printed in as an appendix to your agenda this morning. Together, it represents 12% increase in the delegated schools budget. £11 million that was included as a one-off last year has now been baselined, in addition to 11.8, an additional 11.8 million. This is, I think, the single largest item of expenditure within the council budget, and I think that is traditional, and it reflects the size of the education system as part of the services provided by the council, and the commitment that we as administration have made to prioritising education and social services. But I think best thing I suggest is for the officers to take us through the report, and then they'll be able to respond to any technical questions, and if there are any political issues, I'll happily come in at the end, Chair.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Robert. Helen.
Thank you, Chair. So it is item 10 in terms of the cabinet papers. You've been sent the link already. So specifically, it is item 10. Kelly will be taking us through the report, but this reflects a post-consultation report going to Cabinet, so it's important that it is scrutinised. The consultation with schools has been, as Councillor Smith has noted, through the Statutory School Budget Forum, and you will see there's been a comprehensive consultation and indeed a response from that forum. So I'm happy to answer any questions at the end, but Kelly is going to walk through that report with you and highlight the matters relating to education. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Good morning.
Good morning. So so this year I was advised you didn't need to have that separate report that I would usually do, and that we just needed to take you through the main budget report. So as Helen said, it's item 10, and the link is in the chat if you haven't had that already. So what I'll do is I'll point out the relevant points for you for education and schools, and I'll refer to the relevant paragraphs in that report. So starting with paragraph 2.5, you'll see there that education is due to come in this financial year with an underspend. And a lot of that is down to the transferring of the budget and the usual inflationary risk that goes with home to school transport. So we're transferring that budget over to place. As well as we've used a lot of the new LAEG, the Local Authority Education Grant, to offset core costs within education. So it is something, you know, we've reflected when we've set our budgets then in the paper for 25, 26 and beyond. But obviously that's at risk for us using grants to offset core expenditure because they are temporary by nature. So if the grant ends, then we'll no longer have that core funding available for that provision. So, you know, as Ben has noted in that paragraph in the report, Ben Smith, the underspend in education will help us to bolster support for schools by replenishing the IT reserve. So I can mention that a little bit later on. So section 3.4 highlights that education's cost pressures have been noted by the Welsh Government, although they haven't targeted funding specifically, you know, for that during the settlement with an attached figure. So paragraph 4.6 includes reference to the one-off additional funding that Councillor Smith mentioned earlier that was provided to schools in 24-25. So there were two pots of funding available. One was £4.5 million for energy costs, and that was noting that there'd been an energy cost spike, which is dropping off. So the funding this current year was less than in the previous year. We've had £6 million before. There was also a £7 million one-off transfer from the IT reserve that I just mentioned, and that's money that's been built up centrally for schools to replace their infrastructure and devices that were provided by a Welsh Government grant. The replacement of the items was part of the grant terms and conditions when we had it, so we were building up that reserve and we transferred it to schools as a one-off in 24-25 to help them. So it's those figures that are being topped back up again by the underspend of education this year. So although those two items of funding, the £11.5 million was meant to be one-off, what's happened this year is it's been provided in the core from April 25. So it's protecting schools from that sort of cliff edge drop that we've talked to schools about that was potentially going to be there. So the next paragraph is 4.11. So that's noting that pay has been funded for schools and the Centre for Education at estimated inflationary rates for the coming year. So as would usually happen, if there are any shortfalls then on actual pay decisions, which are made outside of our sort of council structure, as we know, then they would need to be funded from the school's delegated budget unless there's additional grant funding provided by the Welsh Government. That has been the case for the last few years, but we need to wait particularly for the teachers' pay announcements, which will affect the pay from September. So paragraph 4.12, that reminds us that even though there's relative prioritisation of the budget for schools in Swansea, as mentioned earlier by Councillor Smith, it's such a large proportion of the council's budget. You know, it is going to be difficult in the medium-term financial plan to avoid pressures on schools. They are funded by a formula, and then there's local management decisions, you know, LMS, we call it, in individual schools. So that will already see some schools in or close to set in deficit budget. So it does affect schools differently. So a pressure that's being noted at schools in the centre is the increasing demand of learners with additional learning needs in particular. And some of the pressures have been noted in the report as part 2 of Appendix D. So paragraph 4.15, that explains that as well as the baselining of that £11.5 million, so the one-off £11.5 million has been baselined, there's an additional £11.8 million that's been provided for schools overall. So that takes the delegated budget now to just over £213 million, which is the highest it's been. So the cash difference for schools has gone up by 5.9%, which is around double what the expected pay increase is, and more than the 4.7% increase that we've received as a council from the Welsh Government. So paragraph 4.17, that summarises the additional money that's being provided and the balance in savings. The last note on that section does recognise there are substantial levels of school funding provided by grant, in particular the LAEG that I mentioned earlier, and we've also used that to offset the co-education funding as well. So the note also recognises the proposed budget for 25-26 covers most, but not all of the known pressures for schools. And for individual schools, there may need to still be the need to make savings. and to prevent them from going into deficit. So section 5 of the report, that looks at the savings that are made. And under 5.2, it highlights savings under different transformation categories. So we've only got a relatively small one there of £10,000 for right schools in right places. So this is where we're charging project officer time to capital building schemes instead of charging them to our revenue budgets. But it does also show part of that business as usual saving that's there is applied for education as well. So there's more detail for that in Appendix D. And we've already made the majority of those savings ourselves, and that will include things like restructures. We've reduced demand on certain budget areas. We've offset the grant I've mentioned a few times against our core, and we've added inflationary costs to our two of our SLAs, catering and cleaning SLAs, although we are still working with our SLA working group with head teachers to try and keep those costs down, so they're likely to be less than the pressures that we've quoted in the report when we get to the final SLA costings. Onto section 7, this is showing the redundancies. We do only have one shown for education. It's a legacy one, so it's somebody that's actually already left and it's the full year effect this year. So we don't have any other redundancies to note. Although for schools, because of the nature of the delegated budget, until they get their budget share and set their budget plans, we're unable to identify school redundancies at this level. So section 8 isn't specifically about school reserves, but I just thought I would mention for reserves in schools that recent national statistics have shown that Swansea schools are on the higher end of the scale for our reserve balances. Although if the current rate of depletion of our reserves continues, we will have more schools in deficit in the coming years. And that's the case already in a number of other local authorities in Wales, where they do have a lot of schools in deficit positions. So section 11.1 notes that we are still waiting for National Insurance confirmation on the payments that will come through. We're expecting them in June, which of course is after the school budgets have been set. So we have made an assumption of what's to go into the school budget, and hopefully the payments we get will cover that in full. Onto Appendix D then, really. So I've mentioned that a couple of times. If you've looked at that, that highlights the education savings and pressures in the tables there. And then Appendix G is the letter from the School Budget Forum. As we've mentioned earlier, the School Budget Forum is that statutory body that every local authority has to have. So it includes head teachers, governors, union representatives, officers, including myself, the director and cabinet member here now, Section 151 officer, and the leader as well attends. So every year we do ask the School Budget Forum to respond on behalf of schools to the budget consultation, and that letter highlights their response. It does acknowledge that the settlement's better than has been expected, but it does also highlight continuing concerns from schools, including that they do have to continue to support curriculum reform, the additional learning needs, pressures, attendance, staff recruitment and safety. So the medium-term financial plan, as it stands, that's in another report that's going through to Cabinet, but it does show, that in future years there is pressure coming back on to education and schools towards the end of the plan, which, hopefully things will be better by then. But just noting again about the grants, the high level of grants that are supporting schools and the centre, and if those levels of grant reduce or even a standstill, so they don't cover pay awards, that can put some added pressure on education. So that's my summary really of the report. So I don't know if anybody has any questions.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for that resume. Thank you very much. Now, I'm sure we'll have questions, and already I can see Mike has got his hand up. Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly, and Helen and Robert for the introduction. And first of all, I'd like to say that I certainly welcome the increase in the budget as far as the education is concerned. Obviously, a subject very close to my heart as well, and particularly the commitment to the covering of salary and pension costs, and also in connection with being able to baseline the one-off payments that were made last year. So, generally, I welcome those particular elements. My questions, I got several questions. I don't want to kind of hog it, as it were, so maybe sort of take them one at a time. And I got some which would, I suppose, fall into Robert's area, and then the others then would be more technical. If I could do with the technical ones first, if that would be helpful. The ALN funding, obviously, we're all aware of the increasing demand for support and the pressures that there are within schools and education, arising from a whole series of different factors. We see COVID as being an influence. We see potentially improved diagnostic techniques leading to increased demand and so on. And I note that there's a figure of £1 million that's already been allocated extra into ALNet, which is very welcome. But it's just really sort of thinking in terms of how you as officers go about forecasting the need and take those into account as far as the budget is concerned. So it may be that that's not something necessarily that would be of relevance to the discussion now. It might be that within the scrutiny committee we could come back to and have a look, because clearly it's one which is going to have a significant impact upon our budget in the future. So if I just deal with that one at the moment, I see Helen has raised a hand, and then I've got a couple of other technical questions, and then a couple of political comments and questions.
Helen.
Thanks, Councillor Day. You may be aware that we've had 2 additional learning needs strategies, one before the ALNet Act came into place, and indeed the code. And we've consistently had, as part of our additional learning needs strategy, a need to understand really the future in terms of what that means for specialist places, but not just places, but for provision as well. So our strategy is always trying to preempt and indeed horizon scan what is coming. So you will be aware that our sufficient specialist places provision is being catered for in a range of ways. Not only are we expanding school places in our special school, but also as part of our SDF, our specialist teaching facilities review. But one of our major tactics has been to build the capacity of the workforce to support additional learning needs in the classroom at mainstream level, as well as in specialist settings. So that's enabled us to cope with the demand in terms of increased numbers. But in terms of the future, we are working closely, as you know, the ALNet Act covers the 0 to 25 range. So that's enabled us to work closely with health and other providers preschool to understand really what they're experiencing. And obviously our close relationship with the health board in terms of the neurodiversity specifically has enabled us to understand really how some diagnoses and pre-diagnosed conditions are becoming more prolific. So we're working closely with our partners to try and understand the landscape and what that means for us. But you're right to point out that exponential growth in terms of certain conditions, and we are working as hard as we can to predict and project really what that means for us practically in terms of the provision that we are duty bound to provide. So I think it is about collaboration with others to understand and not working in isolation, but it's also trying to meet that demand. Whatever the demand is, we have a duty to meet it, both in mainstream settings, in specialist teaching facilities, and at the sharper end of things in a special school. So it's not an exact science. We can't do it with precision, but at least we are doing as much as we can to try and see what's coming down the line.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm reflecting the comments that were made at the admissions forum last week by a number of the head teachers who, whilst recognising the increased resources being put in, there are various concerns expressed about whether it will be sufficient. And also we were talking, interestingly, then Robert would be aware of how that might impact upon school admissions, but I mean that's for another day. But it's just interested to find out, what the level of analysis is. I guess that having some better feel for how the health body would be able to highlight 0 to 3 needs will help us as youngsters come in from the age of 3. But so it's just a difficult one, isn't it, for us all to face? Kelly's got a hand up.
Kelly, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to add as well, we're creating a new special school and building a new special school as well with an additional 100 places, and that will keep learners in Swansea and provided by Swansea as well. And it'll also help with the SDF review, as Helen mentioned. It's sort of like a staged sort of process, really. The special school at the top there, we've got the SDF review ongoing at the moment. And for the individual schools, we do keep the funding formula constantly under review through the school budget forum that I mentioned earlier and the finance group. But we do remind schools that they shouldn't just look at the line that's on their budget share for additional learning needs. It's the whole budget that should be used to look at all learners within the school. And I just wanted to mention as well that we are looking at a new database. We're tendering a new database that will be able to track pupils a lot better, as well as a new data officer, because we've also recognised, that need to be able to plan now from the 0 to 25 age group.
Great. Sandra.
Yeah, just on that one, please, Kelly. We talked about home to school transport as being a huge draw on the budget. With that in mind, what's the justification then for centralising the ALN and the special school when actually only a few years ago we were decentralising them all in order to reduce those kinds of costs?
Yeah, so at the moment, because of the increase in demand, what we found is there's a lot of learners going out of county for provision. So rather than go out of county, we're providing the additional places that they are taught within our own special schools and within Swansea. So they don't have to be travelling, quite a long distance, sort of every day to go out to those places. With the one special school, we can consolidate transport. So, for example, we've already worked with the schools on using a minibus to pick up the learners rather than them have a taxi. They are actually using their own minibus and their own staff as well, which has worked really well. So the learners are settled. Sort of they know the member of staff as they get in. It's their teaching assistant, perhaps, that's picking them up. So we are rolling that out a lot further as well, the minibus pilot with schools. Obviously, the budget now has transferred over to Place, but that doesn't mean that we've stopped working, with Place, on these sort of projects to be able to make savings and obviously make it better for the learners as well.
Great, thank you.
So what you're saying is that won't massively impact on, correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth. So what you're saying is that won't massively impact on the home to school budget in a negative sense, and actually might impact in a positive sense. Yeah.
Yes, all the different stages should impact positively. And of course,
Yeah.
I don't know whether you've seen the SDF review, and what we're looking at is more sort of, I can't think of the word, Helen, a cluster sort of provision, so that we've actually got in every cluster, we've got provision there for learners. They don't have to be travelling further across Swansea for SDF places or any additional support they need.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Thank you. Could I take Robert, then Mike, and then Angela?
Yeah,
and then Helen.
Thank you, Chair. And I think Kelly has made the point I was going to make. There's been a lot of work that the officers have undertaken in terms of plotting, for instance, where learners live on the journey to school. That's been looked at. And I think it's got to be looked at holistically in terms of the STF review, the savings that can be made there in terms of delivering provision closer to where learners live, as well as changes in how we take children to school. That's going to make an impact. And hopefully, as I said as well, being able to cater for more of Swansea's children within Swansea. All of these changes together are going to help with the home to school transport budget.
Sorry, Mike and Angela, can I take Helen next, in case she's got something to add to that?
Thank you, Chair. Going to Councillor Joy's point, I think in reality what we're looking at is demand supply outstripping demand. So as demand increases, although we may strategize to reduce costs, as that demand comes in, it's very difficult to keep those costs down. So obviously the special school scenario, yes, that would be centralised because it's of a particular nature in terms of dealing with the needs of particular children. But then you're right to point out that the SDF review is essentially looking to support efficiencies in terms of transport and support the well-being of learners in doing so. But as you can see from our current review of the SDFs, we're adding 61 extra places. So whatever we achieve in one corner in terms of efficiency is going to cost more as the demand comes in. So it's a bit like a finger in the dike situation. We're trying to make things better, but those increased kind of pressures also come in at the same time.
Thank you. Mike.
Yeah, just coming back on the transport issue, and I know that there are a number of concerns about the access to public transport. And I think, again, Robert was in the meeting where some of those concerns were expressed. So, hopefully by having the transport provision under one heading now, that we're able to kind of streamline that and enable the children to get to school on time and to get home at a reasonable time as well without having too many bus changes. I did have other questions, but I don't know if Angela wanted to come in on the transport issue before I went on.
Angela.
Thank you. Mine wasn't to do with transport, so I don't know whether you want to carry on with that and then come back to me. It's up to you.
Oh, go on, as you started.
Okay. Mine was two things separately. One, thank you, Kelly, for it all, and the money being added. That's all good news. But you mentioned about school redundancies only being one, which is extremely low, which is great, obviously. But when will you know more in terms of numbers about the school redundancies? Was my first question. And the second question was, because of the high levels of staff sickness in some schools, and obviously the budget being eaten then through agency and stuff, do they have any plans or envisage any help and support being put in the pot for those children with higher level abilities to prevent them from being bored and to encourage them to be challenged? Because I know in one particular school, due to the teachers and TAs all being moved around, those children who normally would have higher sessions for their higher ability, they're not having them anymore. So just wondering if you know any more about that, please. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
So sorry, with the redundancies that were noted in the paper, the one redundancy is for central education, and that is for legacy position that's already finished. Actually, it was like a full year effect for this year. For schools, we won't necessarily know the actual position until they get their indicative budget shares, which we hope to be out before half term. Schools then obviously need to work with their business managers, primary support officers, etc., to be able to set a budget and then come through to the governing body, obviously, to make that final decision. They don't need to do that until the 31st of May, but I'd like to hope that schools have already got a couple of budget plans and scenarios, prepared so that they can act quickly if they do think that they are in a redundancy position. I know our HR have provided a lot of support to schools. Even, prior to Christmas, they were running workshops for schools who thought if they were going to be in a position to highlight the timelines that are available and any support that can be given. But until schools come to us, I think that's the difficulty, is until they get their budget shares, it's difficult for them to know if they have got those redundancies at the moment, but they should know sort of, early in the financial year. Sorry, for your other question, I'm not sure whether, Helen, would you be able to pick up on that one?
Yes, so for more able and talented learners in the classroom, obviously covering a teacher's absence is relatively easily achieved. Covering a teaching assistant's absence, not as easily achieved. One reason being the availability of teaching assistants, both from an agency and otherwise perspective. So in terms of the intervention required for more able and talented learners, then you would hope that a teacher would be able to differentiate and support that agenda as well, to make sure that more able and talented learners are catered for. And indeed, enriching the curriculum is for all learners as well. But if there's a particular concern you have, Councillor O'Connor, then please get in touch and we can see where else we can signpost that school to support more able and talented learners.
Great, thank you. Mike.
Yeah, two other technical questions. One relates to savings and the reduced SLA for therapy services of £20,000. Could you just sort of talk us through that, what the impact of that would be? And the other question then was one that you might not be able to answer or give us straight away, Kelly, but just in connection with school reserves, you mentioned earlier on about the picture being a little bit patchy. Would it be possible for you at some point to send out to us a summary of where individual schools are as far as school reserves are concerned? Because we know that some have got better provision than others, so not something that needs to be done straight away. And then I'll come back a little later to Robert with a couple of political comments.
Right.
Yeah.
Kelly, or Helen, and do you want to?
Can I start with the
kick off with
therapies
those?
one? If I mention the therapies one you mentioned, Councillor Day, that's in relation to the ongoing review of any SLA, but health SLAs are constantly held under review as well. And since COVID, we've been able to recalibrate that SLA to understand what the real cost is, and that's reflected there.
So it wouldn't actually mean any reduction in service to pupils?
No.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. Sorry, Sue. And then Sandra.
I don't know if I should have come on a little earlier when you were talking about the core staffing in education. As attendance is a partnership between the EWOs and schools, is there a plan to make permanent EWOs? Because I know in Gowden we've had 2 within the last few months because their contracts are maybe coming up now in March. Just wondered if there was any plan to make them permanent.
Okay. And shall I take Sandra's question as well, and then you can and then Kelly and Helen can get back. Sandra, your question too.
I just wondered whether it's better to answer Sue. I wanted to talk about the reserves. It's the proper things, isn't it?
Great. Helen then.
Yeah, so I'll take Councillor Jones's question, but I believe there was a second part to Councillor Day's question as well in relation to reserves, which Councillor Joy has pointed out as well. So I'll answer Councillor Jones's question. So in terms of EWOs, as you know, attendance is absolutely high priority for us in education. So the solidity of that team, absolutely high priority. We have had some absences and sicknesses that we are trying to overcome and to make that team as solid as possible. So I can give you an undertaking, Councillor Jones, that team will be as solid as we can make it.
Thank you, because you get used to one person and they move, and yes, it's very difficult then to get some type of pattern in place. Thank you, Helen.
Okay. Kelly.
Yes, I just wanted to come in on the reserves question. I put a link in the chat. We do publish reserves by school every year in the Section 52 outturn statement. It's called all local authorities have to publish that on our website. But I can certainly share where we are. I'm thinking our schools are going to finish for the 31st of March, and of course after that they will be published online as well.
Great, if you could do that, because it'll make it a lot easier for us to pick that up. But fine, thanks. On the issue with reserves, I might, if I could come in and say, I was obviously they dropped. We in the school budget forum, they talk about how they dropped 30% in 22-23, further 15% in 23-24, and expected a similar amount this year. So there obviously are concerns. But over to Sandra, then Mike.
Lyndon, that was my exact question, was from the school forum, what is the projection for 24-25 really, if these school reserves are dropping so rapidly, but also have we got an imbalance here where we have got, and I haven't looked at that Section 52, where we've got some schools holding quite a lot and then other schools who are absolutely on their knees. And I just wondered where we are with that.
Helen.
Yeah, so with the burn rate of reserves, it is accelerating over time, but it's never as bad as we anticipate when we project, if that makes sense. So at the start of a year, we projected to be a lot worse based on what we know. But in Q3 and Q4 of any financial year, we often see money coming from Welsh Government, which can add to school reserves. So that sits there as a reserve unspent. So it's very difficult to be precise in our projections or predictions. But what we do is recognise that across Wales, obviously that reserve position in Swansea is much healthier. And what we see then across Wales is other local authorities with many, many schools in deficits. In Swansea, that position for us is very low in terms of number. So when you point to the unevenness of the distribution of reserves across Swansea, you're very right to point that out. At its worst, we've got schools already in deficit, and then we've got schools carrying reserves that are beyond the recommendation of 5% of the total school budget. So what we've tried to do is be supportive to schools who have dwindling reserves. So those below 5% and getting close to zero reserves, we've tried to triage in terms of our support to those schools. And we've been holding conversations with the ones in the worst case scenario to support them. Although it's a delegated budget, we want to support them in the best way we can to make decisions that will serve them in terms of sustaining their school budgets. Obviously, the ones who have gone below zero into a deficit position, we have what's called a licensed deficit position from the Section 151 officer and also approved by me, which allows a school to recover normally within a 3-year range. So we've got 1 or 2 schools in that category where they need to recover. But when you compare those numbers to other local authorities, they've got multiple schools in deficit positions. So I suppose in Swansea, we are very fortunate that most schools haven't tipped over, but the tipping over does concern us. And we've tried to look very strategically at how we can support schools to avoid that happening. Obviously, if a secondary school tips over, it has greater consequences than a primary school tipping over because the continuity of education can be compromised. So we are working very closely with our schools to understand what's happening, what they can do structurally within their own deficit budgets to try and remedy and recover as quickly as possible. So I think keeping a very close eye on what's happening has served us well, and putting in intervention where it's required is also something that's helping the whole system in terms of that disparate position in terms of reserves.
Great, thank you. Robert.
Do you want to call Kelly for the technical side first, Chair?
Absolutely. Kelly.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just going to mention as well, I think Helen was alluding to it, that quite often during the course of the financial year, we get late grants from the Welsh Government. And because they come in quite late, schools aren't able to spend them by the 31st of March, which just ends up increasing the reserve level. And we do find that happen quite a lot. So we do look every year at correlation. Is there any correlation between reserve levels and the funding formula, just in case there's something we need to try and tweak there? There's not anything that's obvious. Potentially, you know, some schools you get more PDG grant than others, which is obviously outside of our control as well. So what we do find is it is normally down to local decision making on how schools make those spend plans. And as Helen mentioned, you know, as well as us holding this year support meetings and triage meetings with the schools that we thought were going to be the lowest level of reserve or dropping into deficit, which I think most of the schools we've met with have sort of welcomed, because it's not been a challenging approach. It has been a supportive approach and trying to signpost and help them. But every year we do also have to, under our scheme for the financing of schools, challenge schools that have got those very high levels of reserve as well, to find out what the schools, are holding those reserve levels for. So it is a bit of a balancing act really between, the sort of high levels and low levels. But we do, quite a lot to actually try and support and monitor the schools with reserves.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. Robert.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And this is the second time this morning I think I've said Kelly's already said what I was going to say, because, I think the answer to you, Sandra, is yes. There are big variations in the level of reserves at different schools. And as Kelly has just said, when we looked at the funding formula, there didn't seem to be a correlation between the funding formula and different categorizations of schools. So that doesn't seem to be affecting it. That's certain types of school are coming out with higher reserves or lower reserves than others. So I think if that had been the case, if it was that easy, you could tweak with the funding formula and saying, well, there must be something wrong with the funding formula, that it doesn't allow for a level playing field. That's not the case here. So it's a more complicated picture than that. Obviously, there are implications in terms of historic decisions, the way schools' experiences, financial experiences over the years, that always impacts on reserves. But it's not a simple science, and we need to get to the bottom of it.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for that. And Mike.
Yeah, just a comment on that was that in a former life, I did suggest to some head teachers that we create some form of mutual fund where those who had excess of 5% could put that money into the fund to help those who didn't. And I suppose a bit like a credit union. I think it probably goes without saying that the suggestion didn't go down too well. But everybody seems to be very protective of their own reserves. But maybe that's something for another time. Is it possible for me to go on to political comments and?
Sorry, can I just come back on one point, because Mike has touched on it there. We will be and are working with schools to look at, well, what are your staffing structures, what are your expenditure points, and are there ways in which certain schools are working that others could follow, and that would make a financial, if it makes educational and financial sense. And I emphasize that it's going to make educational as well as financial sense.
Great, thank you for that, Robert. Mike, and then Sandra.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. A very quick one really for Robert is that I know that we've had the School Budget Forum response. When will we be able to see a copy of the leaders or cabinet's response to that letter? And the other comment then was just really in relation to the increase in national insurance. Just find it really upsetting that we're in a position of having to see, in this particular case, £2.4 million of funding for schools being diverted to increase national insurance costs. And clearly, it's not a decision that we can influence at all. But I think it's very disappointing that of the increase that you've been able to give to schools, quite a considerable amount of that is being diverted, as it were, to those additional national insurance contributions.
In terms of national insurance, obviously we're waiting outcomes of discussions between Welsh Government and UK Government and how those pan out. But those are decisions, as you said, Mike, that are out of our control locally. What we are committed to doing is making sure that our schools don't lose out as a result of those decisions, and I think that's been reflected in the political commitment that's been given. In terms of the response to the School Budget Forum, yes, certainly when that is available, we will share it with the Scrutiny Committee.
Great, thank you. Sandra.
Sorry, Mike, I think we are on the same page on a lot of this. Both of my other two questions now are related or stem straight from the forum. So it may be, Robert, that you answer this in, at a later stage in response to their letter. There were two things in there that really did concern me. And one was that our expenditure per pupil is the bottom of all of the LAs for in Wales for 24-25. And I found that rather disconcerting, notwithstanding the acknowledgement that you put in an extra 12% in. So that was my first concern. And the second one is a comment from the forum that they don't believe they have enough money to deliver statutory education services for them to be at that stage. So those two comments really rang alarm bells, but I'm putting that against the fact that you're putting 12% in.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that comes from the statistical bulletin that's published by Welsh Government, and I think it's table 5 in that bulletin, because I've been through it when I saw that comment, and yes, that does indicate that expenditure per pupil is at its lowest in Swansea. Now, I think there are, even looking at that table, there are some inconsistencies because the overall amount seems to be at the lowest. But then when you break it down by category of school, by secondary school, primary school, and special school, when I looked at it, it sort of looked to me as if there was a difference in the message coming out there. So I think I will be asking officers to go through this. I don't want to spend too much time on what is and what are national statistics, but there are questions over how those are calculated. And I'm not saying that there's any that the figures are wrong, but I'd like to know what's included, what's the impact of things like the nature of the school estate, the number of schools, the average cost, the impact of average cost, because don't forget, you've got to look at highest and lowest within the local authority, not just the average. And I know in some councils they've got a large number of small schools, which pushes the average up. But then a large school in that authority wouldn't be getting the same as a small school per pupil. So I think there are, and you can look at this ad nauseum in reality, and unfortunately, perhaps I'm one of those who likes to look at those statistics. But I think we certainly need to look at it and see, well, what does this tell us in terms of how we're moving forward here in Swansea. I don't know if you want to call Helen in on that.
Indeed, yeah, Helen.
Yeah, it is an interesting observation, Councillor Joy. In the School Budget Forum, we debated this very point during our meeting with the consultees as well. In reality, when you look at the rank positioning, that's one thing, and our deviation from the average is, we are the biggest deviant, so to speak. But in reality, that what it means per pupil is actually quite low a number. It's probably less than £200 per pupil in terms of deviation from the average. But also you have to look at what is delegated in other local authorities and what is not. So for us, for example, in Swansea, we have a PRU. If we delegated the amount of money that we hold centrally to provide a PRU, we could easily be on the average, or we could easily increase our rankings, because not all local authorities have PRUs, for example. So there are ways of slicing and dicing things in terms of delegation and non-delegation that we could easily go up in the rankings in Swansea. But it's not completely apples and apples. It is an apples and pears scenario.
Okay.
In terms of your second question, Sandra, about statutory responsibilities, yes, we've put more money in, and I'm glad that we as an authority have put more money into the budget, and we put 11 million, don't forget, last year, as a one-off to try and help schools in a particularly difficult year. I don't think we in this country are spending enough on education. We've got expectations on schools. We've got statutory expectations on schools. We've got a situation where the demands on schools because of additional learning needs, the needs of learners, the needs of society, they're all increasing, and they're putting pressure on schools. Whenever there's some crisis nationally, you hear the phrase, someone on TV will say, schools must do more. And schools have been asked to do more for many, many decades on the same level of funding, or practically the same level of funding in real terms. So I think, or less in many respects. So I think, this is an issue that needs to be looked at an all Wales level. It needs to be looked at a UK level. Are we funding our schools to enable them to deliver what we're asking from them? Because we're asking a lot from these professionals, and we need to make sure that they have the resources to deliver.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Mike.
Yeah, I just totally support what Robert said there, and I think we do need, as a kind of society, to be clear about what our expectations and demands are of the education service. And sometimes I think some of the responsibilities of others are being passed on onto schools without necessarily thinking in terms of not just the financial resource implications, but also the ability of schools to be able to deliver those. The other comment I'd just make, and that maybe Kelly could clarify this, but for example, just in terms of the per pupil spending, it does, as somebody mentioned, it's kind of apples and pears. I think Robert mentioned that phrase, that it's a question of what some councils include in their total figure. So, for example, I mean, I don't know whether the transfer of the school transport to place now means that that figure is now no longer included within the education budget, and therefore doesn't count towards the per pupil funding. But I think the bottom line is that, as kind of Robert indicated, is that we do need some more funding from Welsh Government, and hope that they recognise that, and maybe a bit more needs to be done in terms of pressuring Welsh Government in relation to the needs, rather than looking at simply taking the baseline and adding a pure percentage increase to our budgets.
Thank you, Kelly.
Yeah, you're right. It does include home to school transport. But if you consider, we've got an expensive home to school transport service, but if you imagine somewhere like Powys, or more rural areas, their costs are a lot higher. So that's included in there. There are so many other things, whether you delegate additional learning needs, whether you don't, etc. So it is something I raised. We've got an All Wales group called Adu Finance, and I did raise it at the last meeting, and the Welsh Government have said they'll go away and sort of have a look and think about the stats and whether we are sort of able to compare apples with apples from our reports. So yes, I'm hoping that's something that will change as time goes on. Of course, if you think about where Swansea's funded as well, we are funded as sort of lower at the table per head of population anyway from the Welsh Government, because we haven't got that sparsity element in the Welsh Government's funding formula. So we're starting at a low point, as well. So it is difficult. The other thing to note as well, we've talked earlier about the one-off funding that was given to schools in the current financial year for 24-25, that 11 million. That, because it wasn't part of the delegated budget, wasn't included in our stats, but schools did have it. So that's a good example, really, of where, sort of the figures aren't, picking up all of the funding that's available to schools either. So next year, that extra funding will be in there. So it'll be interesting to see where we lie in the table next year.
Okay, great. Thank you. No other hands up. A couple of things, if I might. I'd picked up about the 20, that we were 22nd of the 22 local authorities, but agree it's about apples and pears, and you can't compare them both. And I think there is a need for that sort of, the way that is reported needs to be looked at, not from our point of view and think that we can do, but I think the way Welsh Government are actually reporting that information, it should be more of a level playing field, really, and display what each area are doing. There is a concern, obviously, from the forum, as Sandra mentioned, about, because, and I think Robert said, about all the extra things schools are asked to do, and we find that at Scrutiny when we hear about the tasks that they've been asked to do, but the ability to deliver reform, and I think that is a concern. But if I had a point that Kelly made about the NI contributions, the problem is we'll get compensation, I'm pretty sure, but will it be full compensation? And therefore, that is, if you like, the elephant in the room, because if depending on that level, is the amount that would have to come out of the core spending in education, depending on that level of compensation, whether it's compensation or full compensation. And I think that's the question mark. If anybody got any other questions? If not, I'm mindful of the fact that we've got to sit down and summarise our views for the cabinet, for the feedback to cabinet and to the finance scrutiny panel. So if there aren't any questions, can we move on to item 6? And if Robert, Kelly and Helen want to leave, you're welcome, and you're welcome to stay as well.
No, well, thank you for the welcome, and I think it's appropriate that the three of us would leave, or for me to leave anyway.
Well, listen, thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank the committee.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Helen.
Right, there we go. Thank you all for really excellent questions as well, isn't it? Really, I think pretty challenging questions, and Bridge is there in the background somewhere in the ether. Have you been taking notes, Bridge?
Yeah, yes, indeed, Chair. So, obviously, if you're able at this juncture to kind of like just point out the main areas of concern, things that you think, any red flags that you want to raise. But otherwise, I'll review all the notes in the meeting and kind of, just summarize that and put some bullet points together that kind of hopefully adequately capture the things that you've been talking about this morning. But what would be really helpful is kind of, okay, we definitely need to point this out. We definitely need to say this to cabinet,
Yeah.
Okay. I think. Sorry, I think that before we go into the kind of the red flag areas, perhaps if I'm summarising or capturing other members' views correctly, that we welcome first of all the increase in the budget to education and the baselining of the one-off payments from last year. I think that it's useful to kind of come in with the positives,
and
then we can talk about.
Yeah, I think that's important because that is good news that that commitment has been made, and but then the points that everybody made, Bridge has then got that we can feed in. I would mention at the very final point about the issue about NI contributions, because it is an issue about compensation or full compensation. This is something that I spoke to the finance team in the council about, and it's a concern that they have, and I'm sure everybody, because you can get compensation, which is in the wording, but that's not full compensation, and therefore if there isn't full compensation, where's that going to be met from? Because if we haven't in schools, it could well be the school reserves. Well, a lot of schools haven't got those reserves, and therefore that will increase the amount of redundancies. So I think it is if you were look, it must be a class as serious on the risk register.
Yeah.
And fortunately, we're not going to know until June. And I always think, whatever the government, it would be rather nice to have a 3-year plan. But I don't think that'll ever come up. But I think that should be the outcome, so people can plan ahead properly. But it never is the case, sadly. And I think that's one thing everybody should work to. But any points anybody else would like to make? Otherwise, Bridge, you've got the details.
I think Sandra's point about reflecting some of the comments within the school budget forum response is important. Particularly about their concerns on not being able to deliver statutory services. So just to make that comment, and we'd be interested to hear the leader or the cabinet's response to their comments.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah,
Mike.
and the other thing, if we can, just to kind of raise the issue of ALN funding, and whilst we recognise the strategy that being introduced, the increasing demand, from a societal point of view, and the pressures that's being brought to bear on education and schools in particular. We need to be able to recognise those.
Yeah, and the lack of places in the STF, because the schools that haven't got STFs are still putting things in place to address that issue.
Yeah. Interestingly, at the admissions forum last week, we were talking about that in terms of, if somebody identifies as having a particular need, and there's no STF provision within their catchment area, is there going to be some sort of allowance to enable them to move to another area to access that provision? Because admissions at the moment, as you know, sort of fairly strict in terms of if you don't live within the catchment area, the various criteria are fairly strict and doesn't include any reference to the need to access specialist provision.
Well, in fact, within the last Eston report in the school that I'm chair of governors, that has been identified because the training in our school isn't up to STF standard, although we've got a pupil that needs restraint. And so there's an issue where the training of staff members should be up to point, shouldn't there?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other points for anyone?
Did we want to say anything about school reserves?
I think that's in the points that we did make, but I would we need to highlight that because with the level of reduction of school reserves at this rate, even the schools with good reserves will run out, and it'll be a cliff edge, really. So that is something that is, and it was highlighted by the school budget forum as one of their great worries, really, about that reserves.
Also,
it is a concern.
maybe addressing issues that are happening in the world. The stabbing in the school and the next county to us. What's the implications for our schools putting safety measures in place to prevent that happening? Is that taken into account with the budgets? I don't know.
Yeah. They're talking about the issue in Carmarthenshire. Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Okay. Any other points? And Bridge will send a copy of that around. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
so
it
look
goes,
out. Yeah.
Yeah. When is the finance meeting? It's tomorrow, isn't it?
So yeah, in terms of process, what the feedback from this panel, it will be fed in as part of one overall set of feedback to cabinet, so which is kind of like managed by the Service Improvement Regeneration and Finance panel, which is convened by Councillor Chris Holly. So that's meeting tomorrow at 2 p.m. Later on today, there's a similar meeting to what we've just had is with the social services councillors. So that similarly, but feedback from both of those panel meetings will be sort of sent to the Service Improvement Regeneration and Finance panel. Councillor Holly will then draft a letter, a formal letter for cabinet. Will attend cabinet, so that will contain what you've agreed. So what I send around in terms of a series of bullets, if you can look out for that. Obviously there'll be a little bit of time for you to come back to me and whatever, but obviously time is a little bit short on this. But if you can look at that, give your attention to it and confirm, and I can then perhaps tomorrow morning, let's say, finalise that with you, Lyndon, and the chair, and then sort of we know that's our agreed position. Yeah, so Councillor Chris Holly will attend cabinet. Convener, if you felt the need, depending on the issues that you've raised, to attend cabinet along with Councillor Holly, that's up to you. But Councillor Holly will be sort of tasked with making sure that the feedback from all of the different scrutiny panels that have looked at the budget will be conveyed, and that to cabinet.
Okay, great, fine. Well, listen, thanks everyone, and thanks for your contributions, and see you all on Thursday. Actually, we're lucky this week. We've got two meetings. So see you on Thursday. Bye.
So long.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.